they've trained their body to tolerate this huge amount of calories to the extent where it almost looks like it's beneficial. But I think these extremes are just the reality of the bodybuilding world, and they're going to do it, and it it appears that it's working, but I don't think it's optimal. I don't feel like it's scientific, but as a scientist, we can observe this and realize that something is going on here that we need to understand.
Yeah, I find the variance pretty interesting. Also, what's your opinion on people who are doing so one of the performance mechanisms that I learned years ago from Scott Abel, was my former bodybuilding coach, is he would take people and you'd get down maybe of 12 weeks of dieting, you would get to kind of single digit body fat zones where you were in a hyper adaptive state. And then he would introduce refeeds. And these refeeds would be extraordinary levels of calories in one day. And I remember way back in the late 80s, I think Chris Aceto, who was a well-known bodybuilder, was following Scott around all day long to see how many calories he would eat on that one day. And then he would go back to a significant calorie deficit for 6 days, and then he would hit another spike. What is the research saying? Because one of the things that I don't think that Scott really kind of overlooked was what is the potential consequences from a health perspective. So there was no doubt the performance parameters were there and the aesthetics was there, but what is the health consequences of doing those hyper calorie spike days of, if you're at 2,000 to maybe 5,000, 6,000, even 7,000 or 8,000. Scott used to crack over 10,000 calories a day, which is an exorbitant. And of course, in that kind of diet, he's eating boxes of donuts and everything else. And then, the thermic temperature rises, you're sweating. It's pretty interesting. And then, it takes maybe 2 or 3 days. I can remember when I was doing it way back in 1998, I went from a body weight of 198 pounds to a body weight of 217 in one day. And by the end of the week, I was at 196 and even leaner. That was the kind of variance I was experiencing. And that would be common. You'd spike up 10, 12, 15 pounds. And then at the end of the week, you'd be 2 pounds lower than you were prior to that. What have you experienced any of that, or have you noticed that, or have you seen any of the results of that as far as potential damage? I don't know if that's healthy, but
there's a lot of things going on there. That 20-pound weight gain in one day is part of it's glycogen, a lot of it's extracellular water, some of it's, excess food and water in your GI tract.
Yep.
So it's not all muscle, obviously. Right. But the extra water in your muscles creates a cellular leverage, if you will, probably makes you stronger in the gym, especially on things like pressing exercises.
Yeah.
So what you just described, I think it's far from optimal, but I think it can work in the context of guys with a lot of muscle, and they can get away with crazy amounts of calories, especially if their muscle has depleted levels of glycogen due to, hard and prolonged training. Then that becomes essentially a sink for glucose, for nutrients, for water, and things like that. So you have some pretty remarkable, aesthetic changes that can occur. And, the more people do it, it's like bodybuilders, if the average person did it, it just would not work for them, but they've trained their body to basically, to capitalize on glycogen supercompensation, and they've trained their body to tolerate this huge amount of calories to the extent where it almost looks like it's beneficial. But I think these extremes are just the reality of the bodybuilding world, and they're going to do it, and it appears that it's working, but I don't think it's optimal. I don't feel like it's scientific, but as a scientist, we can observe this and realize that something is going on here that we need to understand. And there are individuals who can do this, get away with it, and get some pretty remarkable effects. So I think it's something that, from a bodybuilding, from a physiology perspective, I would be interested in studying individuals like this, and it could be a consequence of, various ergogenic supplements that they're taking could be further augmenting and allowing them to get away.
But testosterone and these type of things obviously change the dynamic significantly. One of the potential consequences I always thought of that is like what is the corollary damage of eating these quote unquote damaging type foods to the body, as that's not accounting for the health parameters, Okay, there's a certain cosmetic effect or there's a certain performance-based effect, but over the course of doing that for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, do you have any theories of what might transpire as far as potential damages of doing that kind of thing to the body?
Yeah, I think it's really important to track what's happening in the liver when you're doing this. The liver is a very, very good barometer of overall health. So liver enzymes are probably off the charts, especially if there's other pharmaceuticals being used. And your triglyceride levels, your insulin levels, your glucose levels, your hemoglobin A1C. And another thing to look at would be, which I found on a high calorie diet and heavy training, my systemic inflammation was higher. So if I looked at HSCRP, hypercaloric diets with heavy training shot it up, 2, 3, 5. Right now, I'm always like 0.1 or not even detectable. And that's like even with training. So, I think that's another biomarker that I look at to say, this diet is working with my body. There are people who follow ketogenic diet and their inflammation goes up. It could be a consequence of things like polyunsaturated fatty acids, like too much omega-6 fatty acids, and what exactly are they eating? They could have pro-inflammatory fats. But for my diet, which is a eucaloric diet, if I'm not gaining or losing weight, my HSCRP is like non-detectable or 0.2. But if I go hypocaloric and even do a far less extreme version of the scenario that you were talking about, in the context of training too, my inflammation markers go up quite high. And if that's done over and over again, over years of time, I think you're probably knocking potentially years off your life. If this is like what you do, if this is part of the lifestyle that you're following. And it may have resulted in the early demise of some of the bodybuilders or the health consequences that they had with kidney function, liver function, things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know Scott always would be monitoring his athletes' blood panels and stuff and looking at some of these things because, of course, this is an extreme sport and probably not recommended